Welcome to the Health Headliner podcast by Tudu Digital. Our content is informational only and not medical advice. Please consult your provider. Now, let's dive into today's headlines.
Okay, think about this for a second. An activity you probably do every single day, walking. What if that simple act, just walking, could actually hold the key to feeling stronger, sharper, and maybe even protecting you against some effects of aging? It sounds almost too simple, right? But there's this twist, a specific method that's getting a lot of attention. Today, we're doing a deep dive into something called Japanese walking. You might have heard of it. It's been popping up in health news quite a bit. And our mission here is to really unpack it. Go beyond the name. What is it? What's the science actually say? And, what does it mean for you and your own health goals? We want to cut through any hype and just look at the evidence.
Absolutely. And to do that, we've got some solid sources lined up. We'll start with a recent health news piece that kind of brought it to mainstream attention. Then, crucially, we'll dig into the original 2007 scientific paper. This is the one that really laid the foundation for all this research. And finally, we've got a really fascinating abstract from 2018. It gives us insights from a 10-year long-term study, so we can see the effects over time.
Okay, let's get into it then. Japanese walking. It sounds, well, simple, like walking in Japan. Or is there more to it? What is the actual method? Because it sounds like it's more than just, going for a stroll.
Right, that's the key thing. It's not just casual walking. It's a very specific interval-style approach. Basically, you alternate between bursts of higher intensity walking and then periods of lower intensity. It was developed by Professor Hiroshi Noz and Associate Professor Shizu Masuki over at Shinshu University in Japan. They wanted to make walking a more potent form of exercise.
Intervals. Okay, so how does that work in practice? If I wanted to try this tomorrow, what would I actually do?
It's a pretty clear cycle. You walk for 3 minutes at what they call a somewhat hard intensity. Think brisk, purposeful walking. Then immediately after those 3 minutes, you switch to 3 minutes of light intensity walking, a much more relaxed pace. And you repeat that 6-minute cycle. The recommendation is to do this for at least 30 minutes total, so about 5 cycles, ideally 4 times a week.
Somewhat hard and light. Those feel a bit subjective. How do you gauge that? Like, what should it actually feel like when you're doing it?
That's a really good question. It's about perceived effort. For that somewhat hard part, your heart rate should be up, breathing heavier. You should still be able to talk, but maybe only short sentences. Holding a full conversation would feel difficult. You know you're pushing it a bit. Then, for the light phase, your breathing should recover. Talking should feel comfortable again, maybe a little effort, but not a struggle like before. It's about finding those two distinct feelings.
Okay, that makes sense. And what strikes me is how accessible this sounds. You don't need fancy equipment, right? Just maybe a timer or your phone and somewhere to walk.
Exactly. That's a huge plus. No gym, no special shoes beyond comfortable ones. It's very low barrier. People compare it to high-intensity interval training, HIIT, but it's definitely less intense overall, which makes it suitable for a much wider range of people, maybe older adults or people just starting out with exercise.
And potentially less time-consuming than chasing, say, 10,000 steps a day, which can feel like a lot sometimes.
Yeah, that's another angle. 30 minutes, 4 times a week. It's focused. It's about the quality of the effort within that time, not just the sheer number of steps.
Right. Now, this is where it gets really interesting for me, the evidence. You mentioned that 2007 study. This wasn't just an idea they had. They actually tested it scientifically, right? The researchers who developed it.
Precisely. That 2007 paper is foundational. Their main goal was to see if this interval walking could actually improve things like thigh muscle strength, aerobic fitness, specifically peak aerobic capacity, and blood pressure. And crucially, could it improve them more than just doing moderate, continuous walking? That was the key comparison.
Okay, so how did they set that comparison up? Who took part in the study?
They recruited 246 middle-aged and older adults, healthy, non-smokers, average age around 63. The study ran for 5 months, and they split these folks into 3 groups.
3 groups. What were they?
Yeah, one was a control group that didn't do any specific walking training. Another group did moderate intensity, continuous walking. Their target was 8,000 steps a day at a steady pace. And the third group, of course, did the high-intensity interval walking, the Japanese walking method we've been discussing. 3 minutes fast, 3 minutes slow.
Gotcha. And how did they track what people were actually doing, especially the intensity part for the interval group?
Good point. The moderate group mainly used pedometers, just tracking steps. Pretty standard. But the interval group used something more advanced, a triaxial accelerometer. This gadget could measure not just steps, but the intensity of the walking much more accurately. It even beeped to tell them when to switch pace.
Ah, okay. So they had pretty tight control over that interval group's activity. So what happened? What did they find? What were the results for the interval walking group compared to the others?
The results were quite striking. The interval group saw significant improvements. They had notable reductions in body weight, especially the women in that group, and, really importantly, big gains in thigh muscle strength. About a 13% increase in knee extension strength, that's your quads, and a 17% increase in knee flexion strength, your hamstrings. Those are big jumps.
13 and 17%. That's substantial muscle strength gain from just walking.
It really is. And their aerobic fitness improved too. Peak aerobic capacity went up about 8% when measured on a bike and 9% when measured during walking. So their heart and lungs got more efficient. And maybe one of the most significant findings, especially from a public health perspective, blood pressure.
What happened with blood pressure?
Significant reductions.
Huh.
Systolic pressure, the top number dropped by an average of 9 millimeters of mercury. And diastolic pressure, the bottom number, dropped by 5 millimeters of mercury. Those are clinically meaningful drops that reduce cardiovascular risk.
Wow. So strength, fitness, blood pressure, even some weight loss. Quite a package of benefits from this interval method.
Exactly. And here's something really fascinating about the efficiency you mentioned earlier. The interval group actually spent less time walking per week compared to the moderate group aiming for 8,000 steps daily, about 83% of the time if you calculate it based on minutes. But their total energy expenditure per day ended up being similar.
How does that work? Less time, same energy burn.
It's the intensity. Those bursts of somewhat hard walking burn calories at a much higher rate. So even though the total time spent walking was less, the overall energy cost balanced out because of those high-intensity periods. It highlights how efficient interval training can be.
That is efficient. So for people who say they don't have time for hours of exercise, this could be a real solution.
It really points in that direction. 30 minutes, 4 times a week, delivering results like these. It makes consistent, effective exercise seem much more achievable for busy people. It's about working smarter, perhaps, not just longer.
Okay, those 5-month results are impressive. But the big question is always sustainability and long-term impact. Does this stuff last? Does Japanese walking actually help fight off those declines we tend to see as we get older? What about the long game?
That's exactly what that 2018 abstract tackles. It followed participants for a decade, 10 years. They looked at people who started the interval program and compared those who stuck with it consistently for the 10 years, the 10-year interval walking group against a control group. They even looked at a group who started but then dropped out along the way.
Okay, 10 years is a serious commitment. What happened to the control group over that decade? Did they show typical signs of aging?
They did, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Provides a clear baseline. Over the 10 years, the control group showed steady linear declines. Thigh muscle strength dropped by about 30% in men, 20% in women. And peak aerobic capacity went down by roughly 20% for both men and women. That's pretty typical age-related stuff if you're not actively working against it.
Okay, so that's the baseline. Now, how did the group that kept up the interval walking for 10 years fare in comparison?
This is where it gets really remarkable. Their muscle strength did decline slightly over the 10 years. You can't stop aging entirely, but it remained significantly higher than the control group. They were much stronger than their peers after a decade. And the aerobic capacity finding is even more stunning.
Go on.
Their peak aerobic capacity actually increased by about 20% in the first 6 months of the program. And then this is the amazing part. They maintained that higher level for the next 9.5 years. So after 10 years, compared to the control group, their muscle strength was at least 20% higher, and their aerobic fitness was at least 40% higher.
40% higher aerobic capacity after 10 years compared to controls. That's huge. It suggests you can really push back against age-related fitness decline.
It really does. It suggests that this kind of consistent structured activity can preserve function to a remarkable degree over the long term. They didn't just slow the decline, they improved and largely held on to that improvement.
What about the dropout group? The ones who started but didn't stick with it for the full 10 years, did they just revert back to the baseline?
Interestingly, no, not entirely. Even the participants who stopped the training still showed a slower decline in their peak aerobic capacity compared to the control group. So while the benefits weren't fully maintained like in the consistent group, there seemed to be some residual protective effect. It suggests the initial training still offered some lasting advantage, even after stopping.
That's actually quite encouraging, too. It implies that even periods of doing this kind of exercise can have some lasting impact. Okay, so putting this all together for the listener, it sounds incredibly promising. But Are there any caveats? Any limitations we should be aware of? Is it truly for everyone?
Good question. We should be balanced. The original 2007 study had a couple of points worth noting. Like we mentioned, they used different monitoring tools at the accelerometer for the interval group, pedometer for the moderate group. That difference in measurement precision could have influenced things slightly. Also, the interval group had more frequent contact with the trainers because of the monitoring system. That extra interaction could have boosted motivation or adherence.
Right, the real-world application might be slightly different if you're just doing it on your own.
Exactly. And adherence is a real factor. Remember, about 22% dropped out of the interval walking group in that first study, and 17% from the moderate group. So while the method is effective, it might not suit everyone's preferences or lifestyle long term. Consistency is key, but it can be challenging. It's powerful, but maybe not a universal magic bullet.
That health news article we looked at raised a really good point building on this. It asked something like, is it less about the specific exercise, like is it Japanese walking versus cycling versus swimming, and more about just hitting that intensity level consistently?
I think it's a really insightful question and likely gets to the heart of it. What decades of exercise research tell us, pretty consistently, is that regular, moderate to vigorous physical activity is crucial. Japanese walking provides a very clear, efficient, evidence-based structure for achieving that. But the underlying principle is getting your heart rate up, challenging your muscles and cardiovascular system regularly. That consistent stimulus, whether through interval walking or something else you enjoy and can stick with, seems to be the critical factor for those long-term health benefits.
So the big takeaway isn't necessarily everyone must do Japanese walking, but rather that finding a way to incorporate periods of higher intensity, that somewhat hard feeling, into whatever movement you do is really beneficial.
Precisely. Japanese walking is a fantastic template for how to do that with walking. But if you prefer cycling or dancing or swimming, applying a similar principle of varying your intensity likely yields similar benefits. It's about making regular, challenging physical activity a sustainable habit.
Okay, so whether it's trying the specific Japanese walking method or finding your own way to boost intensity, the message seems clear. Adding those bursts of effort can pay off significantly for strength, fitness, blood pressure, and potentially keeping you feeling younger and more capable for longer.
Absolutely. It's about finding your way to consistently get that moderate to vigorous activity in week after week, year after year. That seems to be the real key.
So maybe a final thought for everyone listening to mull over. How could you personally weave a bit more of that somewhat hard effort into your routine? Maybe you try the 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off structure. Or maybe tomorrow during your usual walk, you just decide to power walk up that hill instead of taking it easy. Or consciously take the stairs a bit faster. What small, deliberate change could you make today to dial up the intensity just a notch?
Thanks for tuning in to the Health Headliner podcast by To Digital. Like and subscribe for more health news and breakthroughs. Stay healthy and informed. See you next time.